This is a download from the BBC. To find out more, visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4.
Hello, the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill believed that, quote, the true philosophy is the marriage of poetry and logic, unquote. He was one of the first thinkers to argue that a social theory must engage with the ideas of culture and the internal life. He used Wordsworth to inform his social theory. He was a proto-feminist, and his treatise On Liberty is one of the sacred texts of liberalism. J.S. Mill believed that action was the natural articulation of thought. He battled throughout his life for social reform and individual freedom, and was hugely influential in the extension of the vote. Few modern discussions on race, birth control, the state and human rights have not been influenced by Mill's theories. How did Mill's utilitarian background shape his political ideas? Why did he think romantic literature was significant to the rational structure of society? On what grounds did he argue for women's equality? And how did his notions of the individual become so central to modern social theory? With me to discuss J.S. Mill are A.C. Grayling, Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck, University of London, Janet Ratcliffe-Richards, Reader in Bioethics at University College London, and Alan Ryan, Professor of Politics at Oxford University. Anthony Grayling, can you just give us an idea of Mill's significance as a philosophical and political thinker, an outline?
Well, he's certainly the major British philosopher of the 19th century, I think. And the impact that he's had on subsequent debate in all the different fields that you've just mentioned there has been very considerable. I mean, you find him being cited in technical philosophical discussions in theory of perception, in logic and philosophy of mathematics, not always with approval, but he's there anyway. And he is certainly a very, very large figure in political philosophy and social philosophy. So his classic On Liberty is a much read, much cited, much discussed book. In fact, for all its apparent clarity and simplicity when you read it, it's a short book, a very interesting and eloquent book. It is very rich in topics for discussion and has been the centre of an industry, really. So his influence has been enormous.
When you said industry, can you just elaborate that a little?
Well, when you open the essay on liberty and you read the first paragraph or so, he says in it, I've got a very simple thesis to argue, and that is that society has no right to coerce an individual other than to prevent that individual from harming others. And you might think that that's a pretty straightforward thing to be pushing as a line, and a worthy line too. But then it turns out immediately to have all sorts of inner rich complexities, and they've been the basis of a lot of scholarly discussion since.
He was born in 1806 and was writing until the end of his life in 1873. What were the big themes of British politics at that time? What was his context, Anthony?
Well, when he was born, 1806, of course, the United Kingdom was at war with France, and it was going through a tremendous change socially and economically. It was the very earliest phases of the Industrial Revolution. Agricultural Revolution had already happened. So it was a pullulating age, really, with a lot of different things happening. And one of the important things that was happening was the attempt at reform, led by Bentham and John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. And they were the inheritors of a tradition in the 18th century, mainly led by dissenters, who were trying to get more social justice, reform of Parliament, rights for working people, all of which had been stymied in the 1790s because of the French Revolution. And so the effort at social reform had to reinvent itself in the early decades of the 19th century. And John Stuart Mill was an inheritor of that.
So he was riding on the back of this great wave of nationalism, industrialisation, inequality, the women's question, and so on. And he, as it were, sort of surfed that in his work, as well as going deeper in other areas.
Well, I mean, it was certainly not just happening all around him, but the people who were directly influences on him, his own father, Bentham, Ricardo, who was a big friend of his father's, were themselves at the very centre of these endeavours. And when, after the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which extended the franchise somewhat, Mill became disillusioned by the process of reform that had been going on in the previous decades, he felt it necessary to settle down and rethink how this reform process was going to be best conducted. And a lot of his best work, really, done later on in political economy and in politics, the essay on liberty and his work on utilitarianism, stems from the rethinking that he did of his legacy from Bentham and his father.
Janet Ratcliffe-Richards, Mill was influenced by utilitarian thinking, particularly by Jeremy Bentham, who was his godfather. Can you give us the basis of utilitarianism and how it influenced him?
Well, the essence of utilitarianism is it gets you out of a lot of traditional ways of thinking about ethics, in that it has nothing to do with revealed religious ethics, of course, and it has nothing to do with simply appealing to your, at least it's not supposed to have anything to do with simply appealing to your intuitions about what's right and wrong. Bentham had the idea that ethics could be turned into a science where you could calculate what the right thing to do was. And the idea was that you should be trying to produce happiness, which was the really important thing. And if you regarded yourself as trying to produce happiness, then you had to understand the workings of the world and the workings of people in order to try to work out the best way to produce the best outcome. So it wasn't a matter of sitting with pre-existing rules in the assumption that, say, God knew how to bring about the best outcome. We actually had to do the science to work out what the best outcome was. Now, there was, of course, an intuition in the root of all that, which was the idea that happiness was the important thing to go for.
How was it different from hedonism in that sense?
Well, it wasn't, in a way, except that it had the idea that every person's happiness counted as much as anybody else's.
As I understand it, Bentham's idea of happiness was quantitative, wasn't it?
Well, it couldn't be quantitative in itself because you have to have something to have a quantity of. But are you now drawing a contrast with Mill?
Yes.
Well, Mill was pushing to a different kind of idea of the sort of happiness we should be aiming for. And it's often said that Bentham's happiness was that of a contented pig, and it's better to be a discontented human being than a contented pig, or that it's better to be a discontented Socrates than a contented fool. So Mill was committed to certainly producing the best outcome, but he went for what he called, what were the higher pleasures, which he thought were not just those of contented pigs. It was better to have
So he made a
kind
hierarchy of
discontent.
pleasures, didn't he?
Well, yes, he did, except that his view of the hierarchy of pleasures was that if you'd had experience of all of them, you would go for these higher ones, which essentially means that if you'd had experience of them, they would make you happier. So it's not clear that there's qualitative and quantitative difference.
Bentham was also interested in penal reform and the abolition of capital punishment and great social issues. Did Mills pick up those views from him?
Well, he certainly picked up the general idea of the approach to social reform and the like. But interestingly, he was different on capital punishment in a way which is quite interesting for illustrating the way utilitarians think. Mill was in favour of capital punishment, but on a rather curious ground. The utilitarian idea of punishment is that you shouldn't do harm to the person being punished just in itself, because suffering is always bad. So the only justification you have for punishment is preventing worse kinds of harm. Now, Mill had the idea that penal servitude for life, which was the alternative to capital punishment, was in fact much worse than being killed. On the other hand, people were more afraid of being killed than they were of penal servitude for life. So you actually caused less harm, but at the same time deterred people more effectively with capital punishment than you did with penal servitude.
Alan Ryan, Mill's father, James Mill, as I've said, was a colleague of Bentham's ideas. And can you tell us what impact they had on J.S. Mill's upbringing and this fabled and most singular education he gave his son?
Mill's autobiography is Mill's own record of that education, and he tells the reader that the only thing the reader is to pay any attention to about this autobiography is that it is a record